I knit sweaters for all my grandkids every Christmas. This year not a single one called, not even to say thank you. My daughter said, "They're teenagers now. Get over it." So I donated every gift, every keepsake, every family memory, to kids who actually smiled. Now they call me Grandma. And my phone finally rings. The package sat on my kitchen counter like an accusation. Returned to sender, unopened. 3 weeks after Christmas, and there it was. Bryce's sweater, the one I'd spent 47 hours knitting, complete with cables that matched his grandfather's favorite fishing vest. The postal service had stamped it with red ink. Refused return to sender. I stared at that box until my coffee went cold, remembering the night I'd finished it. December 15th, 2 in the morning, my arthritic fingers cramping as I wove in the final threads. Josh's old flannel shirt lay beside me, the blue and gray one he'd worn every Saturday morning while teaching the kids to fish. I'd carefully unraveled strips of it, incorporating them into the sweater's pattern. Pieces of their grandfather, literally woven into something meant to keep Bryce warm. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd refused warmth itself. Chloe's sweater had been even more intricate. A delicate Fair Isle pattern in dusty rose and cream, colors that would complement her auburn hair perfectly. I'd started it in September, working evenings while watching her old dance recitals on my tablet. Each stitch held a memory, her first pirouette at age 4, the way she'd run to me after every performance, sweaty and glowing, demanding I feel how fast her heart was beating. Bradley's had been the simplest. A classic crew neck in forest green, his favorite color since he was 7 and decided he wanted to be a park ranger. No fancy cables or intricate color work, just honest, sturdy stitches that would last him through college and beyond. I'd knitted in the round, imagining him wearing it during late-night study sessions, pulling it close when he missed home. 3 sweaters. 3 grandchildren. 17 years of Christmas mornings where they'd actually worn my gifts, posed for photos, hugged me tight and said, "I love it, Grandma Lauren." But somewhere between their 13th and 16th birthdays, everything changed. The hugs became brief shoulder pats. The excited phone calls dwindled to obligatory holiday texts. Last Christmas, Chloe had opened my gift, a hand-embroidered scarf, smiled politely, and immediately set it aside for something with a brand name and a price tag. I should have seen the signs then. This year I'd mailed the packages early, December 10th, each one wrapped in gold foil paper with corners so sharp they could cut glass. Inside each box, alongside the sweater, I'd tucked a handwritten note. Not just, "Merry Christmas," but real letters. Memories of our time together, hopes for their futures, reminders of inside jokes we used to share. For Chloe, "Remember when you were 8 and insisted we have tea parties every Sunday? You'd make me wear that ridiculous feathered hat, and we'd discuss very important matters like whether unicorns preferred sugar cubes or honey in their tea. You always said I made the best cookies, but really you made the best memories." For Bryce, "Your grandfather would be so proud of the young man you've become. He always said you had his hands, steady and sure." I hope this sweater reminds you that some of the best things in life take time to create, just like the man you're becoming. For Bradley, "You once told me that trees were the earth's way of reaching toward heaven. Every time I see an oak tree now I think of you and smile. May this sweater keep you warm while you're out there saving the world, one forest at a time." I'd signed each letter the same way, "All my love, Grandma Lauren, who believes in you always." Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and silence. I'd set my phone on the kitchen table, volume turned up high, coffee growing cold as I waited. Surely they'd call. At least Chloe, she'd always been the most sentimental. Nothing. Not a text. Not a voicemail. Not even one of those generic group messages teenagers send, "Thanks for the gift." I waited 3 days, checking my phone obsessively, refreshing social media to see if they'd posted any Christmas photos. There was Chloe in a new designer jacket, clearly expensive, definitely not handmade. Bryce with some gaming headset that probably cost more than the yarn for all 3 sweaters combined. Bradley wearing what looked like a store-bought hoodie, grinning beside a new skateboard. No sign of my gifts anywhere. On December 28th, I broke. I called Allison, my voice carefully neutral despite the hurricane in my chest. "Hi honey. Just wanted to make sure the packages arrived safely. I haven't heard from the kids." Her sigh came through the phone like a dismissal. "Mom, they got them. They're just busy." Too busy for a 2-minute phone call? Look, they appreciated the thought, but they're teenagers now. They have their own style, their own interests. Maybe next time just get them gift cards or something practical. Something practical. As if love could be practical. As if 17 years of Christmas traditions could be replaced with a piece of plastic and a preset dollar amount. I put a lot of work into those sweaters, Allison. Hours and hours. I used fabric from Dad's old shirts. Mom, please. They're not little kids anymore. They don't want homemade stuff. It's not personal. But it was personal. Every dropped stitch I'd carefully picked up. Every late night I'd stayed awake perfecting a pattern. Every time I'd held those sweaters up to imagine my grandchildren wearing them, feeling surrounded by love even when I wasn't there. I just thought they might call to say thank you, I whispered. They're teenagers now, Mom. Get over it. Get over it. Like 17 years of being their devoted grandmother was something to simply move past. Like the arthritis in my hands that made every stitch an act of determination didn't matter. Like the pieces of their grandfather I'd woven into those sweaters were just scraps of old fabric. After I hung up, I sat in Josh's old recliner, holding the ball of yarn I'd been saving for next Christmas. More of his flannel shirts, carefully unraveled and ready to become part of something new. I'd planned to make Bryce a vest, something he could wear over dress shirts when he started college interviews. Now I wondered if he'd even recognize the fabric. If any of them remembered their grandfather well enough to appreciate having a piece of him close to their hearts. The house felt smaller that night, filled with the echo of traditions that had outlived their welcome. I looked around at 17 years of framed Christmas photos. All those smiling faces in hand-knitted scarves and mittens, surrounded by the warmth of family and the promise that love like this would last forever. Apparently I'd been wrong about forever. The walk to my bedroom closet felt like a pilgrimage to a shrine I'd built without realizing it. Behind the sliding door lay 17 years of careful curation. Shelves lined with wrapped packages that had never found their way to the right hands. Boxes labeled with names and dates that had lost their meaning. There was the cashmere scarf I'd knitted for Chloe's 16th birthday, still pristine in tissue paper. She'd opened it, smiled briefly, then asked if I had the gift receipt because cashmere isn't really my vibe anymore, Grandma. Below it sat Bradley's unused fishing vest from 2 Christmas ago, hand-embroidered with tiny trout along the pockets, inspired by his childhood obsession with catching minnows in my backyard pond. He'd outgrown fishing the same summer he'd outgrown needing his grandmother. My fingers traced the edge of a photo album I'd never given to Allison, every page carefully arranged with pictures from her childhood, complete with handwritten captions in my best penmanship. Allison's first steps, taken right here in Grandma's kitchen. Reading bedtime stories until we both fell asleep. The day she learned to braid my hair and called herself my personal stylist. How had I not seen it before? I wasn't preserving memories, I was hoarding ghosts. Each item told the same story, my desperate attempt to keep loving people who had already moved on. The rejection from Christmas hadn't just stung, it had shattered something deeper. 4 months, maybe years, I'd been loving photographs instead of people, holding on to versions of my grandchildren that existed only in my carefully crafted memories. Chloe wasn't the little girl who insisted on matching pajamas for our sleepovers anymore. Bryce had stopped asking me to teach him card tricks. Bradley hadn't called me Lolo, his special name for me, in over 2 years. I'd been knitting sweaters for children who no longer existed, writing letters to hearts that had grown beyond needing my particular brand of love. The realization should have crushed me. Instead it felt like waking up. I pulled down the first box, Chloe's unused scarves and mittens from the past 3 years. Then Bryce's collection of hand-knitted caps that had never touched his head. Bradley's stack of personalized bookmarks for novels he'd never read. One by one, I emptied the closet onto my bed until the comforter disappeared beneath a mountain of misplaced affection. But it wasn't just their unused gifts. Deeper in the closet I found my own forgotten treasures. Photo albums from trips Josh and I had taken before the grandchildren were born. A jewelry box filled with earrings I'd deemed too fancy for everyday wear, saving them for occasions that never came. Books I'd bought but never read because I was too busy making things for people who didn't want them. Among the forgotten items, I discovered a wooden recipe box my own grandmother had given me 40 years ago. Inside, her handwritten cards were yellowed with age. Grammy's famous snickerdoodles, Sunday pot roast for the family, Lauren's favorite chocolate cake. Recipes I'd memorized but stopped making when the grandchildren decided they preferred store-bought desserts. My grandmother's neat cursive on those cards looked nothing like my own hurried scrawl on the gift tags I'd been writing for years. Hers were simple, made with love for my special girl. Mine had become desperate dissertations trying to explain the meaning behind every stitch, every choice, every carefully selected color. When had I stopped believing that love should be simple? I sat cross-legged on my bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of my own disappearance. Somewhere between first grandchild and now, I'd erased myself in favor of being their perfect grandmother. The one who remembered every preference, accommodated every phase, adapted to every change in their interests. I'd become a supporting character in my own life. The charity boxes started as 3 neat piles. Chloe, Bryce, Bradley. But as I sorted through items, the names began to blur. These weren't gifts rejected by specific people anymore. They were beautiful things, carefully made, thoughtfully chosen, that deserved to be loved by someone. I wrote "for someone who'll smile" on the first box in black marker, the letters bold and certain. Then the second box. Then the third. Each label felt like a small act of rebellion against the version of myself that had spent years apologizing for caring too much. The phone book still sat in my kitchen drawer, an artifact from a simpler time when finding help meant flipping through yellow pages instead of scrolling through screens. Harbor Light Shelter had a small advertisement, providing hope for displaced families and vulnerable youth. I'd donated money before, the occasional check written during guilty moments when I realized how blessed my own family was. I'd never considered that they might need more than money. Harbor Light Shelter, Maria speaking. Hi, I'm wondering if you accept donations of clothing and household items? Always. What did you have in mind? I looked at the boxes stacked beside my kitchen table, each one representing hours of work and hopeful love. Hand-knitted items mostly. Sweaters, scarves, blankets. Some photo frames and keepsakes. Things that were made to be cherished. Maria's voice warmed perceptibly. Oh honey, that sounds wonderful. We have kids here who've never owned anything made specially for them. When can you bring them by? That afternoon, I loaded my car with more care than I'd taken preparing for any Christmas morning. Each box was secured with seat belts, treated like the precious cargo it had always been meant to be. The drive to Harbor Light took 12 minutes. 12 minutes to travel from my world of unappreciated abundance to a place where appreciation still existed. The building looked smaller than I'd expected. A converted Victorian house with cheerful yellow trim and flower boxes that someone was tending despite the January cold. Through the windows I could see children of various ages gathered around tables, working on homework or playing quiet games. Maria met me at the door, a woman about my age with kind eyes and hands that showed the calluses of someone who worked with purpose. You must be Lauren. Let me help you with those boxes. As we carried them inside, a little girl with dark braids and serious eyes approached us. She couldn't have been more than 7, wearing jeans that were too big and a sweater that had seen better days. Are those really for us? She asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and disbelief that made my chest tight. I knelt down to her level, meeting those serious eyes with my own. Yes, sweetheart. From Grandma Lauren. The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. That little girl's name was Sophia, and she wore my forest green sweater, the one originally meant for Bradley, like it was made of gold thread. The sleeves were too long, but she'd rolled them up carefully, creating perfect cuffs that she smoothed down every few minutes as if afraid the magic might disappear. Can you teach me to make one like this? She asked during my second visit to Harbor Light, her small fingers tracing the cable pattern I'd spent weeks perfecting. I found myself saying yes before I'd even thought it through. By the 3rd week of January, I had established what Maria laughingly called Grandma Lauren's Corner in the shelter's common room. Every Thursday at 2 o'clock I'd arrive with my oversized knitting bag, thermoses of hot cocoa, and enough yarn for whoever wanted to learn. The response was overwhelming, not just from the children but from the teenage mothers who watched from the doorway, trying to look disinterested while clearly longing to join in. 8-year-old Marcus was my most eager student. He'd been at Harbor Light for 3 months after his mother lost their apartment in a kitchen fire. His thin fingers struggled with the yarn at first, but he had the kind of determination that reminded me of myself at his age, when my own grandmother had taught me to knit during long summer afternoons. Grandma Lauren, he said during our 4th lesson, the word rolling off his tongue as naturally as breathing, can you show me how to make the bumpy parts like on Sophia's sweater? Grandma Lauren. No hesitation, no awkwardness, no need to earn the title through years of birthday gifts and Christmas traditions. Just acceptance, pure and simple. Within a month, I had 6 regular students ranging from age 7 to 17. Sophia, Marcus, and twin sisters named Emma and Lily who'd been living in their car with their mother before finding Harbor Light. There was also Jake, a lanky 15-year-old who initially claimed knitting was only for girls, but couldn't resist the challenge of creating something with his own hands. Most surprising was Destiny, a 16-year-old mother with a baby daughter named Hope. She'd watch our lessons while bouncing Hope on her hip, and one day I simply handed her a pair of needles. "I don't know how," she protested. "Neither did they when they started," I replied, nodding toward Sophia and Marcus, who were now confidently working on simple scarves. During our sessions they asked questions that pierced straight through to my heart. Sophia wanted to know if I had grandchildren of my own. Marcus asked why I came every week when nobody was paying me. Emma wondered if I'd ever teach them to make fancy stuff, like the sweaters they'd seen in my donation boxes. But it was Jake who asked the question that changed everything. "Grandma Lauren, do you think some people just don't know how to appreciate good things?" I paused in the middle of demonstrating a knit stitch, his words hitting closer to home than he could have known. "Sometimes, sweetie. Sometimes people get so busy looking for the next big thing that they forget to see the beautiful things right in front of them." "That's dumb," Sophia declared with the brutal honesty only children possess. "If somebody made me something this nice, I'd wear it every single day." These children, who had every reason to be bitter, who'd lost homes and stability and security, were teaching me about gratitude in ways my own grandchildren never had. My phone started ringing regularly, but the calls weren't from Faisalabad or wherever Allison's family happened to be that week. They were from Maria, updating me on new arrivals who might benefit from our knitting circle. From other volunteers who'd heard about our program and wanted to help. From local yarn shops offering to donate supplies. One particularly memorable call came from Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman whose knitting group at the senior center had disbanded when too many members passed away or moved to assisted living. "I heard about what you're doing," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I have bags and bags of yarn just sitting here. Could you use them?" That Saturday, Mrs. Henderson arrived at Harbor Light with enough supplies to keep us busy for months. She stayed for hot cocoa and stories, and by the time she left, she'd signed up to co-teach our Thursday sessions. It was during one of these expanded sessions in late January that my personal phone buzzed with a notification from social media. Chloe had posted a new photo, herself in a trendy oversized hoodie, arms spread wide in what teenagers called a fit check. The caption read, "Wish I got something cool for Christmas #winter style." I stared at that post for a full minute, sitting in Harbor Light's common room while Sophia showed off her nearly finished scarf to anyone who'd look. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. Here was my granddaughter, publicly lamenting her lack of cool Christmas gifts, while 50 feet away, children who'd lost everything wore my hand-knitted creations like crowns. "Grandma Lauren, are you okay?" Marcus asked, noticing my sudden stillness. "I'm perfect, honey," I said, tucking my phone away. And for the first time in months I actually meant it. The call from Allison came 3 days later, during my Thursday evening quiet time, what used to be my waiting for grandchildren to call time but had become my planning next week's knitting lesson time. "Mom, what's this I hear about you volunteering at some shelter?" Her tone carried that familiar edge of barely contained irritation. "I teach knitting to children there. It's very fulfilling." "But why there? Why not volunteer at the kids' school or something family-related?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed my life, as something that should revolve entirely around her family's orbit. "Because these children appreciate what I have to offer," I said simply. "The kids just forgot to call it Christmas, okay? It's not that deep. They're busy with school and friends and—" "Allison, stop." My voice was gentler than I felt. "I'm not angry. I'm not holding grudges. I'm just done chasing people who treat me like background noise." Silence stretched between us, filled with years of unspoken expectations and mismatched priorities. "That's not fair, Mom." Fair would have been a 2-minute phone call to say thank you. Fair would have been acknowledging that someone spent 47 hours making something specifically for you. Fair would have been remembering that your children have a grandmother who loves them. They know you love them. Do they? Because their actions suggest otherwise. Another pause, longer this time. So what, you're just giving up on your own family? I looked around Harbor Light's common room, where photos of our knitting circle decorated one wall. Children beaming while holding up their latest creations, teenagers who'd learned that their hands could make beautiful things, mothers who discovered they had more strength than they'd realized. I'm not giving up on family, honey. I'm just expanding my definition of it. After I hung up with Allison, the house felt different, not empty but purposeful. I walked to my craft room, which had been Josh's home office before he passed, and spread out a large sheet of butcher paper across his old desk. At the top I wrote in bold letters, Grandma's Corner, monthly care packages. The idea had been brewing since my conversation with Jake about people not appreciating good things. These shelter kids deserved more than my Thursday visits and weekly knitting lessons. They deserved to know that someone was thinking about them when they weren't around, that they mattered enough to receive surprises just because. I divided the paper into columns. Recipient names, interests, sizes, and what I called heart notes. Special things I'd noticed about each child that I wanted to celebrate. Sophia loved purple and always asked about my grandmother's cookie recipes. Marcus collected smooth stones from the shelter's small garden and lined them up on his windowsill. Emma had mentioned wanting to learn to read music, while Lily dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. The first monthly boxes took me 3 weeks to prepare. Each one contained a hand-knitted item, scarves for the February cold, along with something special I'd chosen specifically for that child. Sophia got a purple scarf and a handwritten collection of my grandmother's easiest cookie recipes, complete with illustrations. Marcus received a deep blue scarf and a book about geology I'd found at the library's used book sale. But it was the personalized notes that made me cry as I wrote them. Dear Sophia, you asked me if your smile reminds me of anyone. It reminds me of sunshine after rain and of every good thing I've ever hoped for. Keep shining, sweetheart. Love, Grandma Lauren. Marcus, your hands are learning to create beautiful things just like your heart creates joy wherever you go. These stones you collect remind me that even small things can be treasures when someone notices their beauty. You notice everything beautiful, sweet boy. Love, Grandma Lauren. Word spread faster than I anticipated. During my third Thursday session in February, Mrs. Henderson arrived with her neighbor, Dorothy, who'd recently lost her husband and was looking for ways to fill the silence in her house. Dorothy brought her sister-in-law, Ruth, who'd been estranged from her own children for over a decade after a family argument she could barely remember anymore. By March, our little group had grown to 8 women, ranging in age from 57 to 82. We met every Tuesday evening in my living room, which suddenly felt alive with purpose and conversation. Each woman had her own story of displacement, from grandchildren who'd outgrown them, from children who'd grown too busy or too distant, from families that had shrunk through death or disagreement. Ruth surprised us all by admitting she'd never learned to knit. I was always too proud to ask for help, she said, her fingers fumbling with the needles as Dorothy patiently showed her the basic stitches. Figured I'd missed my chance. There's no expiration date on learning something that brings joy, Mrs. Henderson replied, and I saw Ruth's shoulders relax for the first time since she'd joined us. We established a system. Each woman adopted 2 shelter residents and committed to monthly care packages. But what started as a knitting circle evolved into something deeper. We became research partners, hunting down book series when we discovered a child's reading preferences, sharing recipes when someone mentioned missing their grandmother's cooking, pooling money to buy art supplies for budding artists. Dorothy, who'd been a librarian for 40 years, started including carefully selected books in every package. Ruth, despite being our newest knitter, had a gift for writing encouraging notes that made the teenagers cry happy tears. Mrs. Henderson contributed her late husband's collection of National Geographic magazines, which became treasured items among the kids who dreamed of seeing the world beyond their current circumstances. The transformation wasn't just in the shelter children, it was in us. Tuesday evenings became the highlight of my week, filled with laughter and shared purpose in ways my quiet house hadn't experienced since Josh died. We celebrated each other's successes. Ruth's first completed scarf, Dorothy's granddaughter finally returning her calls, Mrs. Henderson's decision to adopt a cat from the animal shelter. In April, a reporter from the local newspaper contacted me after hearing about our program from Maria at Harbor Light. Janet Morrison was a feature writer looking for positive community stories, and something about our group had caught her attention. "I'd like to write about what you're doing," she said during our phone call. This kind of intergenerational connection, women supporting displaced youth. It's exactly the kind of story our readers need to hear. The interview took place at Harbor Light on a Thursday afternoon, surrounded by our knitting students and their latest projects. Janet asked thoughtful questions about how the program started, what motivated us to continue, and what we'd learned from the experience. What would you say to other grandmothers who might be feeling disconnected from their own families? She asked, her pen poised over her notepad. I thought about Allison's dismissive words about Christmas morning silence, about 17 years of traditions that had quietly faded away. I'd tell them that love doesn't have to be limited by DNA. Sometimes the family that chooses you loves you better than the family you were born into. The article appeared on a sunny Thursday in late April, complete with a photo of me surrounded by Sophia, Marcus, and the twins, all of us holding up our latest knitting projects. The headline read, "Disowned by blood, embraced by heart. Local grandmother finds new family through community service." My smile in that photo was genuine in a way it hadn't been for family pictures in years. These children, these Tuesday evening women, this purposeful life I'd built from the ashes of rejection, it had given me back myself. The article's impact was immediate. My phone rang constantly for days. Other women wanting to join our group, shelter directors from neighboring towns asking about starting similar programs, yarn stores offering donations. But the call that surprised me most came on a Saturday evening, 3 days after the article ran. "Mom." Allison's voice was different, smaller somehow. "I saw the newspaper article. Chloe and Bryce saw it too. They asked me why you didn't send them anything for their birthdays this year." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. I told them the truth. That you spent years making them beautiful things and they never even called to say thank you. Bryce actually cried, "Mom." He said he didn't realize you'd stopped trying. "I didn't stop trying, honey. I just started trying somewhere else." The conversation that followed was longer and more honest than any we'd had in years. But for the first time in months, I wasn't the one doing all the emotional labor. That conversation with Allison lingered in the quiet corners of my house for days afterward. Her words about Bryce crying had cracked something open inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of sad recognition that maybe they had cared more than their silence suggested. Maybe they just didn't know how to bridge the gap their neglect had created. 3 nights later, I sat at Josh's old roll-top desk, the one he'd inherited from his father and never quite fit his long legs under properly. I pulled out a sheet of my good stationery, the cream-colored paper with my initials embossed at the top that I'd been saving for special occasions, that never seemed important enough. "Dear Chloe," I began, then stopped. My hand hovered over the paper as 17 years of memories flooded back. Not the hurt ones this time, but the golden ones I'd been afraid to revisit. "I'm writing this letter not because I'm angry, but because there are things you should know about your grandfather that I realized I never properly told you." The words flowed easier than I expected. I wrote about the morning Josh had taught 4-year-old Chloe to fish, how she'd insisted on braiding dandelions into his hair while they waited for the fish to bite. I wrote about the way he'd light up when she performed her made-up dance routines in our living room, how he'd applaud so enthusiastically that the neighbors probably thought we were hosting concerts. "Your grandfather had this ritual every time you visited. He'd press a penny into your palm and tell you to make a wish on it, then throw it in the old wishing well at the park. You'd always wish for the same thing. I wish Grandpa and Lolo live forever. He kept a coffee can full of pennies just for your visits. After he died, I found it in the garage with a note, for Chloe's forever wishes." He believed in magic. I believed in her. I sealed that letter in an envelope, writing her name in my careful cursive, then pulled out another sheet. "Dear Bryce," this one began. "Your sweater, the one you never wore, had pieces of your grandfather's favorite flannel shirt woven into the cables across the chest. Not random pieces but specific ones. The pocket where he kept his reading glasses. The collar that smelled like his aftershave even after I washed it. The sleeve cuff that got paint on it when you two built that birdhouse in our garage." I wrote about Josh's gentle hands teaching Bryce to whittle, how they'd spend hours on the back porch creating miniature animals from scraps of pine. I wrote about the way Josh had saved every single one of Bryce's school drawings, even the abstract ones from kindergarten that looked like colorful explosions. He used to say you had steady hands and a steady heart, just like his own father. When you were 8, you made him a wooden fish during one of those whittling sessions. He carried it in his wallet until the day he died. It's still there in the wallet I keep in his dresser drawer, worn smooth from his fingers. The third letter was the hardest. Bradley had been Josh's shadow in those early years, following him around the yard as he tended his vegetable garden, asking endless questions about why tomatoes grew up instead of down and whether earthworms had feelings. Dear Bradley, I wrote, my handwriting growing shakier as emotion threatened to overwhelm me. Your grandfather taught you to love growing things because he said you had earth hands, hands that could coax life from soil. Remember the sunflower contest when you were 7? You were convinced yours would grow taller than the garage. Josh secretly fertilized it extra every morning before you woke up, then acted amazed when it reached 12 feet tall. I wrote about Josh's pride in Bradley's environmental awareness, how he'd beam when his youngest grandson would lecture adults about recycling or insist on walking instead of driving to save the planet. I wrote about the tree they'd planted together in our backyard. A small oak that was now taller than the house, its roots deep and strong. That tree blooms every spring and I think about both of you when I see it. He said trees were the earth's way of showing us that some things grow stronger when their roots go deep. Your roots are deep, Bradley, even if you've forgotten where you planted them. 3 letters. 3 grandchildren. 3 sealed envelopes that sat on my desk like unexploded emotions. I couldn't bring myself to mail them, but I couldn't throw them away either. They contained too much truth, too much love, too much of Josh's memory to simply discard. But they also felt like artifacts from a version of myself I was still learning to let go of. The grandmother who explained and justified and pleaded for understanding. Instead, I placed them in the desk's secret compartment, the small hidden drawer Josh had shown me years ago when we'd first inherited the piece from his father. Every good desk has secrets, he'd said, winking as he demonstrated the tiny brass catch that released the hidden space. Maybe someday my grandchildren would be ready to read these letters. Maybe they'd search through my belongings after I was gone and discover them, finally understanding the depth of what they'd casually discarded. Maybe they'd never find them at all. The uncertainty felt strangely liberating. That same week, Sophia graduated from our beginner knitting class to advanced techniques. She'd mastered cables and was ready to attempt lace patterns. Intricate, delicate work that required patience and precision. As I watched her small fingers confidently manipulate the yarn, creating beauty from simple loops and twists, I realized something profound. I was no longer knitting to fill empty spaces or to prove my worth. I was knitting because these children asked me to teach them, because they wanted to learn something I could share, because the act itself had become a meditation on connection rather than a desperate attempt to maintain it. Ruth brought her first completed sweater to our Tuesday meeting. A simple pullover in sky blue that she'd made for her adopted shelter teen, a 14-year-old named Crystal who was aging out of the foster system. Ruth's stitches were slightly uneven, her seams a bit wobbly, but Crystal had worn it to school every day for a week and sent a photo of herself grinning in it. She calls me Grandma Ruth, Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. No one's called me Grandma in 15 years. Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. It's different when they choose you, isn't it? When you're not trying to earn love, just giving it. That night, I opened the secret drawer one more time and looked at those 3 sealed letters. They represented the mother and grandmother I used to be. The one who felt compelled to explain every emotion, to justify every hurt feeling, to teach lessons even when no one was listening. I closed the drawer gently, leaving the letters in their hidden darkness. Perhaps they'd remain there forever, or perhaps someday they'd serve their purpose. But for now they were simply there. Truth preserved in a safe place, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. I had other letters to write now. Thank you notes to yarn shop owners who donated supplies. Birthday cards for shelter children who'd never received mail addressed specifically to them. Messages of encouragement for the women in our Tuesday circle who were learning to redirect their nurturing energy toward grateful hearts. Letters that would actually be read. Letters that mattered to their recipients. Letters that built bridges instead of burning them. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the familiar rhythm of clicking needles and soft yarn sliding through my fingers. But the sound echoed differently now. Not in the hollow quiet of a house waiting for appreciation that never came, but in the warm buzz of my living room filled with the Tuesday circle, or the cheerful chaos of Harbor Light's common room. Marcus, now 9 and grown 2 inches since I'd first met him, sat beside me during our Thursday session, his own needles working steadily on a scarf for his baby sister. His mother had found stable housing and they'd be leaving Harbor Light soon. A success story that filled my heart even as it reminded me that these relationships too were temporary. Grandma Lauren, he said, pausing to untangle a dropped stitch, can you tell me more about your husband? The one whose shirts you put in the sweaters. I smiled, reaching for the ball of soft gray yarn that had once been Josh's weekend gardening shirt. What would you like to know, sweetheart? Did he like to build things? My dad used to build things before he went away. The question hung in the air with such vulnerable hope that I had to swallow past the sudden tightness in my throat. He loved building things. Birdhouses mostly. And he taught my grandson. I caught myself, the old possessive language feeling foreign now. He taught a little boy I used to know how to whittle wooden animals. Marcus nodded solemnly. Could you teach me? I promise I'd be careful with the knife. That afternoon I stopped by the hardware store and bought a beginner's whittling kit. The clerk, a young man about Bradley's age, smiled when I explained it was for a boy at the shelter. My grandmother taught me to whittle, he said. Best gift anyone ever gave me was showing me my hands could make something beautiful. The whittling lessons became part of our routine. Marcus had Josh's patience and steady hands, and within weeks he'd created a small menagerie of wooden creatures. Each time he finished a piece, he'd hold it up with the same pride I remembered seeing in Bradley's eyes all those years ago. But it was during one of these lessons that the phone call came, the one I'd been unconsciously dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Mom. Allison's voice was strained, different from our previous conversations. Chloe wants to talk to you. She's been asking about you since the newspaper article. My heart did something complicated. A flutter of hope mixed with protective skepticism. Put her on. Grandma Lauren? Chloe's voice was smaller than I remembered, uncertain in a way that reminded me of the little girl who used to call me when she had nightmares. Hi, sweetheart. I saw the article. About the shelter and the knitting and everything. Pause. Mom told me about the sweater. The Christmas one. I didn't know you. I didn't realize. I waited, letting her find her words while Marcus continued his whittling beside me, giving me something to focus on besides the racing of my pulse. I'm sorry, she finally whispered. We all are. Bryce cried when Mom told him about Grandpa's shirt being in his sweater. We didn't know you put part of him in there. The apology I'd once desperately craved now felt strange, too late and too early all at once. Thank you for saying that, Chloe. Could I maybe come visit sometime? I want to see what you're doing at the shelter. And maybe learn to knit? I never asked you to teach me, but I should have. The old me would have said yes immediately, would have started planning lessons and special projects and ways to recapture lost time. The new me paused, looking around at the life I'd built from the pieces of my broken expectations. The shelter always welcomes volunteers, I said carefully. If you're serious about learning to knit, I teach classes every Thursday at 2. I meant, could I come to your house? Like we used to. Oh, honey. The endearment slipped out before I could stop it. My house isn't really set up for teaching anymore. All my supplies are at the shelter now. But you're welcome to join us there. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of changed relationships and shifted priorities. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller still. You don't want to see me alone, do you? The question pierced through my carefully constructed defenses. The truth was complicated. I did want to see her, but not the way we used to exist together, with me performing grandmotherhood while she passively received it. If she wanted to be part of my life now, it would be on different terms. I want to see you learning something new, I said finally. I want to see you caring about something beyond yourself. The shelter would be good for that. Mother's Day arrived with an unseasonably warm morning and a text from Allison. Kids said Happy Mother's Day. Hope you're well. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Instead, I opened my checkbook and wrote a donation to Harbor Light. Not a large amount, but enough to buy art supplies for their after-school program. In the memo line, I wrote, in honor of the mothers who choose to love without condition. The real Mother's Day gift came later that afternoon. Sophia, now 10 and preparing to move to a transitional housing program with her mother, knocked on my door with a carefully wrapped package. Happy Mother's Day, Grandma Lauren, she said, beaming as she handed me the gift. Inside was a hand-knitted bookmark, crooked stitches and uneven tension, but made with the kind of concentrated love that perfectionism could never match. Attached was a note in her careful handwriting. Thank you for teaching me that my hands can make beautiful things. You are the best grandma in the world. I cried then, holding that imperfect bookmark like the treasure it was. 2 weeks later, Emma, one of the twins who'd been living in their car, graduated from high school. The ceremony was held at the Civic Center, and I sat in the audience wearing my best dress and clutching a bouquet of flowers, surrounded by other families celebrating their children's achievements. When Emma's name was called, she looked directly at me and waved, her smile brighter than the stage lights. After the ceremony, she found me in the crowd and threw her arms around my neck. "Grandma Lauren, you're the only family I wanted here," she whispered against my ear. "Thank you for believing I could do this." Standing there, holding this brave young woman who'd overcome homelessness and uncertainty to reach this moment, I realized something profound. The ache in my chest, the one that had lived there since that silent Christmas morning, was still present, but it had transformed. It was no longer the sharp pain of rejection, but the tender soreness of a heart that had stretched to accommodate more love than it had ever imagined possible. I thought about those 3 letters hidden in Josh's desk, about my grandchildren who were finally reaching out, about the complicated dance of forgiveness and boundaries that lay ahead. Maybe they would become part of this new life I'd built. Maybe they wouldn't. But for the first time since Christmas, the uncertainty didn't terrify me. I had learned the difference between giving love and begging for it. And that knowledge, hard-won and precious, was the kindest gift I'd ever given myself. If this heartwarming revenge story touched your heart, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Lauren found her true family at the shelter and heard Grandma Lauren for the first time. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Want more inspiring stories of second chances and finding where you truly belong? Subscribe and hit that notification bell. My husband's secretary moved into our guest room to help with paperwork, then demanded I serve her breakfast in bed. My husband laughed. "She outranks you now." I smiled, served the meal and waited. The moment I heard Grant's keys jingling at the front door that Friday evening, I knew something had shifted. Not because of any dramatic premonition, but because of the way he cleared his throat 3 times before even crossing the threshold. His nervous tell that I'd learned to recognize after 12 years of marriage. "Erin." His voice carried that particular tone he used when he'd already made a decision and was preparing to present it as inevitable. "We need to talk. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that quiet strength and behind-the-scenes competence deserve recognition, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this. Now let's see how this breakfast tray becomes the most powerful weapon of all. I was folding laundry on the living room couch, matching his work shirts with the methodical precision that had become second nature. The same routine we'd fallen into since we both started at Meridian Foods. Him as a floor manager overseeing production schedules, me handling the endless stream of customer orders and returns at the front desk. We weren't the power couple we'd once imagined ourselves becoming, but we were steady, reliable, or so I'd believed. "Lisa needs a place to stay," he announced, settling into his recliner without looking directly at me. "Her lease is up and the commute from her current place is killing her. She's been staying late almost every night this week and I can see how exhausted she is." The admiration in his voice when he said her name made my hands pause mid-fold. His secretary for the past 8 months. 26 years old, auburn hair always perfectly styled, and possessing that effortless confidence that made everyone in the office gravitate toward her desk. "She's incredibly organized," Grant continued, his enthusiasm building. "Yesterday she restructured my entire filing system without being asked. Found 3 supplier contracts that were about to expire. Saved us from potential delays." The woman's sharp as a tack. I resumed folding, keeping my expression neutral. "Where exactly would she stay?" "The guest room." He said it casually as if we were discussing dinner plans. "Just temporarily until she finds something closer to work. Maybe a month, 2 at most." The guest room. The space that still held my mother's handmade quilts, the cedar chest she'd given us as a wedding gift, and the collection of family photographs spanning 3 generations. It wasn't just a room. It was sacred territory filled with memories and heirlooms that connected me to something larger than our increasingly routine existence. "Don't you think we should have discussed this first?" I kept my voice measured, but something cold was beginning to form in my chest. Grant finally met my eyes and I saw a flicker of irritation cross his features. It's not permanent, Erin. The woman needs help and we have the space. I thought you'd be more understanding. Understanding. The word hung between us like an accusation. In Grant's world, being understanding meant agreeing without question, supporting his decisions even when they directly affected my life and home. That weekend, as I watched Lisa move her belongings into our guest room, I tried to convince myself this was temporary. She arrived Saturday morning with 3 suitcases, a laptop bag, and an apologetic smile that seemed genuine enough. I really appreciate this, Erin, she said, standing in the doorway of what had been my private sanctuary. Grant told me you were okay with it, but I wanted to thank you personally. Of course, I replied, though the words felt foreign in my mouth. Make yourself comfortable. She immediately began rearranging furniture, moving my mother's rocking chair to make room for a small desk she'd brought. Watching her transform the space with casual efficiency, I felt something fundamental shifting beneath my feet. Sunday evening, as I prepared dinner, I asked Grant if Lisa would be joining us. The question seemed innocent enough. We'd always been the type of couple who included house guests in our meals. His laughter caught me off guard. Not a gentle chuckle, but a sharp, almost mocking sound. Maybe ask her nicely, he said, not looking up from his phone. She's kind of above your pay grade now. The words hit me like a physical blow. Above my pay grade. As if I were some entry-level employee seeking audience with corporate royalty. The casual cruelty of it, the way he elevated her while diminishing me in my own home, created a wound I hadn't expected. I stood there holding a wooden spoon, marinara sauce dripping onto the kitchen floor, processing the reality that my husband had just ranked me beneath his secretary in the hierarchy of our own household. Excuse me. I managed. Grant glanced up, apparently surprised by my tone. What? I just meant she's got a lot of responsibility at work. Important projects. She might be too busy for family dinner. But we both knew that wasn't what he'd meant. The damage was done and something inside me crystallized into cold determination. That night, lying in bed beside Grant as he scrolled through work emails, I made a decision. If Lisa was going to be treated like royalty in my home, then I would serve her accordingly. But service, I was beginning to understand, could take many forms. The next morning, I woke before dawn and began preparing the most beautiful breakfast I could create. Scrambled eggs with fresh chives from our garden, perfectly golden buttered toast, sliced strawberries arranged in a delicate fan, and coffee brewed in our French press. I arranged everything on my grandmother's best china, the set with tiny blue flowers that had survived the Depression and 3 generations of careful handling. Standing outside the guest room door with the tray, I took a steadying breath. This was where it would begin, though I couldn't yet see where it would end. I knocked gently. Lisa? I've brought you breakfast. She opened the door wearing silk pajamas that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, her hair somehow perfect despite having just woken up. Her eyes widened as she took in the elaborate tray. Oh wow, you didn't have to. Time to start your day, I interrupted with a smile that felt strange on my face. Grant says you outrank me now, so I'll serve accordingly. For a moment she looked genuinely surprised, perhaps even uncomfortable. But then something shifted in her expression. A recognition of power dynamics, of having gained ground in some unspoken territory war. She smirked, and in that expression, I saw everything I needed to know about who Lisa really was beneath the professional charm and apologetic gratitude. That's very thoughtful, she said, accepting the tray with newfound confidence. I do have a big day ahead. As she closed the door, I remained in the hallway for several long moments, my grandmother's tray now in the hands of a stranger who'd invaded my sanctuary and accepted my husband's casual dismissal of my worth with obvious satisfaction. But as I walked back to the kitchen, something else was growing alongside the hurt and anger. A plan was forming, though I couldn't yet articulate its shape. I only knew that breakfast was just the beginning, and Lisa had no idea what kind of service she was really going to receive. Grant found me washing dishes, humming softly to myself. That was nice of you, he said, pouring his own coffee into a regular mug. See? I told you she'd fit right in. I smiled and continued washing, my movements steady and purposeful. Oh yes, I agreed. I have a feeling this arrangement is going to work out perfectly. He kissed my cheek and headed off to shower, completely missing the edge in my voice. But then Grant had been missing a lot of things lately. The breakfast tray sat empty outside Lisa's door an hour later, every crumb consumed. Tomorrow I decided I would serve her again. And the day after that. Each meal prepared with the same meticulous care, the same gracious presentation. After all, important people deserved special treatment. And I was going to make absolutely certain Lisa felt very, very special indeed. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after crossing a line you never thought you'd cross. As I stood in my kitchen at 5:30 a.m., grinding fresh coffee beans and whisking eggs to perfect fluffiness, my movements carried a new sense of purpose. The herbal laxative tablets sat innocuously in my medicine cabinet, remnants from a brief diet phase 2 years ago when I'd convinced myself that internal cleansing would somehow fix the growing distance between Grant and me. Now, as I crushed half a tablet into powder with the back of a spoon, I told myself this was just evening the playing field. Lisa had disrupted the balance of my home, my marriage, my sense of self-worth. A little digestive discomfort seemed like appropriate compensation. The powder dissolved completely into the scrambled eggs, invisible and tasteless. I plated everything with the same meticulous care as the day before. Fresh berries arranged in a perfect spiral, toast cut diagonally, coffee served in the delicate cup that matched the china pattern. Standing outside her door, tray balanced perfectly, I felt a strange mixture of guilt and anticipation. This wasn't me. I'd never been vindictive, never been the type to seek revenge through subterfuge. But then again, I'd never had someone move into my sacred space and openly smirk at my husband's casual dismissal of my value. "Good morning, Lisa," I called softly, knocking with my free hand. She opened the door wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, her phone pressed to her ear. "Hold on," she said into the device, then looked at me with mild irritation. "Oh, breakfast again. I thought you might need your strength today," I said, maintaining my pleasant smile. "Grant mentioned you have that important client presentation." Her expression softened slightly at the mention of work. "Right. Yes, that's today." She took the tray without really looking at it, already turning back toward her phone conversation. "Thanks, Erin." The dismissal stung, but I'd expected it. As I walked back downstairs, I heard her resume her conversation. "Sorry about that. Just the housekeeper bringing breakfast." Housekeeper. The word followed me into the kitchen where I began preparing Grant's much simpler meal, toast and coffee in our everyday dishes. When he appeared 20 minutes later, tie askew and rushing as usual, I handed him his travel mug without comment. "You're quiet this morning," he observed, pecking my cheek absently. "Just thinking about the day ahead." I smoothed his tie, a gesture so automatic it required no conscious thought. "Drive carefully." An hour later, Lisa emerged from the guest room looking slightly pale but perfectly put together in a navy business suit that highlighted her figure. She'd eaten every bite of breakfast, I noticed as I collected the empty tray. "Feeling all right?" I asked with genuine-sounding concern. "Fine," she replied curtly, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Though I might be coming down with something. My stomach feels a bit unsettled." "Oh no," I murmured sympathetically. "There's been something going around the office. Would you like me to make you some ginger tea for later?" She waved me off, already heading toward the door. "I'll be fine. Important day today." But by 10 a.m. my phone was ringing. "Erin." Grant's voice carried a note of frustrated confusion. "Lisa called in sick. Says she's having stomach issues. Can you cover her desk for a few hours? Just answer phones and reschedule a couple of appointments." "Of course," I replied, already reaching for my car keys. "I hope she feels better soon." Walking into the office and settling behind Lisa's desk felt surreal. Her workspace was immaculate, color-coded files, expensive pens arranged in perfect lines, a small succulent plant that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries. Everything designed to project competence and sophistication. The phone rang constantly. Clients needing quotes, suppliers confirming deliveries, employees with scheduling questions. I handled each call with the same efficiency I brought to my own work, taking detailed notes and following up promptly. By lunch, I'd rescheduled 3 meetings, resolved a billing dispute, and organized Lisa's chaotic email inbox. "You're a lifesaver," said Jennifer from accounting, stopping by around noon. "Lisa's system for tracking invoices has been driving me crazy for weeks. This actually makes sense." Other colleagues began gravitating toward the desk, asking questions they'd apparently been storing up. I answered what I could, made notes about what needed Lisa's attention, and gradually began to understand just how many small fires had been smoldering while she focused on more glamorous projects. "Honestly, Erin," whispered Tom from shipping during a brief lull, "you should be the one sitting here permanently. You actually know how the company works." The compliment warmed me in a way I hadn't experienced in years. At my usual station I was invisible, reliable but unremarkable. Here, behind Lisa's desk, people actually saw me as competent, valuable, necessary. When I arrived home that evening, I found Lisa curled on the living room couch, still in her business suit but looking decidedly worse for wear. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her usual confident posture had crumpled into something more vulnerable. "How are you feeling?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Terrible," she admitted, pressing a hand to her stomach. "This came out of nowhere. I've never had stomach problems before." "Sometimes stress can manifest physically," I offered gently. "New living situation, demanding job, all that responsibility Grant's been giving you." She looked at me sharply as if trying to determine whether there was hidden meaning in my words. "Grant says you covered for me today. Just answered phones and rescheduled a few things. Nothing too complicated." He seemed pleased. Her tone carried a note of irritation that she tried to disguise as gratitude. "Thank you." That night, preparing Wednesday's breakfast, I added another half tablet to her eggs. Not out of malice, I told myself, but out of curiosity. How long would it take for the pattern to become clear? How would Grant react when his perfect secretary proved unreliable? By Thursday, Lisa had missed 2 full days of work. Grant was growing visibly frustrated, making frequent trips to her room to check on her condition and offer various remedies. I watched these interactions with fascination, noting how quickly his admiration transformed into annoyance when inconvenienced. "She needs to see a doctor," he announced Thursday evening, pacing the kitchen while I prepared dinner. "This is affecting important projects." "Poor thing," I murmured, stirring the pasta sauce. "Maybe it's something she picked up before moving in. These things can take time to work through your system." Friday morning, Lisa appeared in the kitchen looking genuinely miserable. Her usual polished appearance had given way to sweatpants and an oversized shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that made her look younger and more fragile. "I think I need to see a doctor," she said, accepting the breakfast tray with shaking hands. "This can't be normal." "Probably wise," I agreed. Though sometimes these digestive issues resolve on their own once the underlying stress is addressed. She gave me another sharp look, but I was already turning away to tend to the coffee maker. As she carried her tray upstairs, I noticed she moved more slowly, her usual confident stride replaced by careful, measured steps. Standing at the kitchen window, watching Grant's frustrated gestures as he talked on his phone in the driveway, probably explaining Lisa's continued absence to increasingly impatient colleagues, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Control. For the first time since Lisa had smirked at me in the guest room doorway, I was the one shaping events rather than simply enduring them. The breakfast tray, innocent and beautiful as ever, had become my weapon of choice. And the best part was that no one suspected the quiet, reliable wife in the kitchen of anything more subversive than excessive hospitality. Tomorrow I decided I would bring Lisa breakfast in bed again. After all, she needed her strength. The following Monday, I arrived at the office to find chaos brewing behind the carefully maintained corporate facade. Lisa had returned to work after her extended sick leave, but the accumulated damage from her absences was becoming impossible to ignore. "Where's the Morrison Industries file?" I heard Jim from procurement asking anyone within earshot. Lisa was supposed to have it ready for the quarterly review. I glanced toward Lisa's desk, where she sat looking pale and overwhelmed, frantically shuffling through papers with shaking hands. The confident woman who'd smirked at me just 2 weeks ago had been replaced by someone fragile and desperate, jumping at every phone ring and email notification. "I put it somewhere safe," she was saying into her headset, voice strained. I'll find it and call you back." But I knew she wouldn't find it because I'd seen her filing system during my days covering her desk. Important documents mixed with coffee shop receipts, client contracts buried under promotional materials for office supplies. Her organization was all surface-level aesthetics with no functional foundation. By Tuesday, the cracks had widened into full breaks. Lisa sent the Harrison Company's confidential pricing structure to their direct competitor by mistake, mixing up email addresses in her distracted state. The phone call from our sales director echoed across the entire floor. How does something like this happen? Michael's voice carried through the thin office walls. This is basic professional competence we're talking about. I watched Grant's face flush red as he took the call in his office, Lisa standing beside his desk with tears threatening to spill. Through the glass partition, I could see him gesturing frantically, his mouth moving in what were clearly apologies and damage control promises. When the call ended, Grant's voice rose loud enough for half the office to hear. Lisa, this can't happen again. I've been covering for you, but this is beyond what I can fix. She burst from his office, brushing past my desk without acknowledgement, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. I continued typing my reports, documenting every detail of the supply chain inefficiencies I'd been observing for months. That evening, their confrontation in our driveway was impossible to ignore. I stood at the kitchen window, ostensibly washing dishes while watching Grant pace back and forth, his arms waving in frustrated gestures. I put my reputation on the line for you, his voice carried clearly through the evening air. Do you understand what kind of position this puts me in? Lisa's response was too quiet to hear, but her body language spoke volumes. Shoulders hunched, head down, the posture of someone who knew they were drowning. 20 minutes later, Grant stormed into the house, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. She's under a lot of stress, he announced to no one in particular, heading straight for the refrigerator and pulling out a beer. I'm sure she is, I replied mildly, not looking up from the dishes. You don't understand the pressure she's under. New living situation, demanding job, everyone watching her every move. The irony wasn't lost on me. Everyone watching her every move, except the person who should have been paying the closest attention to her actual work quality. The next morning, I knocked on Lisa's door with her breakfast tray, noting how long it took for her to answer. When she finally appeared, her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. I'm not very hungry, she said, but accepted the tray anyway. You need to keep your strength up, I replied gently, especially during difficult times. She looked at me sharply as if searching for hidden meaning in my words. People at work think I'm incompetent. I'm sure that's not true, I said, though we both knew it was. Sometimes when we're not feeling well, everything seems harder than it should be. That afternoon, while Lisa was at another doctor's appointment trying to determine the cause of her persistent stomach issues, I submitted my workflow efficiency proposal to our department supervisor. 3 pages of detailed suggestions born from 12 years of watching processes break down and inefficiencies compound. The proposal outlined simple solutions for common problems: automated backup systems for critical files, standardized email protocols for client communications, and a streamlined approval process that would prevent important documents from getting lost in bureaucratic shuffle. I didn't mention Lisa by name, didn't point fingers or assign blame. I simply presented solutions to problems that had been festering for months, problems that anyone paying attention would have noticed and addressed. Friday brought the Morrison Industries disaster. Our biggest client, responsible for 30% of our quarterly revenue, called to inform us that their expected shipment had never arrived. The delivery trucks were sitting at the wrong warehouse, 2 states away, because someone had failed to confirm the updated shipping address. I watched Grant's face cycle through confusion, realization, and horror as he traced the error back to Lisa's desk. The confirmation email sat unread in her inbox, flagged as important but buried under dozens of less critical messages. This is a $250,000 mistake, I heard him tell our regional manager over the phone. Yes, sir, I understand. It won't happen again. When he hung up, Grant sat in his office for a long moment, staring at his computer screen with the expression of a man watching his career prospects evaporate in real time. Lisa tried to explain, her voice carrying across the office in desperate, broken sentences. I've been so sick I must have missed it somehow. The email system has been acting strange. Maybe someone deleted it by mistake. But there was no one to blame except herself, and everyone knew it. The sympathetic glances from coworkers had transformed into eye rolls and whispered conversations by the water cooler. That evening, Grant brought Lisa flowers, a pathetic bouquet of grocery store roses that seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. I watched through the kitchen window as he handed them over in the driveway, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry I yelled yesterday," I heard him say. "This isn't your fault. You're dealing with health issues." But the apology rang hollow even from my position 50 feet away. The flowers were less about genuine remorse and more about his own guilt over hiring someone based on attraction rather than qualifications. When he came inside, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, working on a follow-up memo to my efficiency proposal. "She's going through a difficult time," Grant said, settling heavily into the chair across from me. I looked up from my screen and really studied his face. The stress lines that had deepened over the past 2 weeks, the way his eyes avoided mine, the defensive set of his jaw. "You're right," I said quietly. "I'm not a manager. I don't have to make the hard decisions or take responsibility when things go wrong. I just keep things running smoothly, day after day, year after year." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Grant opened his mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Later that night, as I prepared Lisa's breakfast for Monday morning, I reflected on how quickly facades could crumble when the foundation beneath them proved faulty. Lisa's charm and polish had been enough to secure her position, but couldn't sustain her performance when subjected to real pressure. I measured the herbal supplement with scientific precision, no longer pretending this was anything other than deliberate strategy. The breakfast tray had become my instrument of revelation, exposing truths that had been hidden beneath surface appearances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for Lisa to demonstrate exactly who she was when stripped of Grant's protection and her own carefully constructed image. And I would be there, reliable as always, documenting every failure with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally found her purpose. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of electric tension that precedes either triumph or disaster. Hartwell Industries was scheduled for their annual facility tour at 10 a.m. The account that represented our largest contract renewal, worth more than any other client relationship in our company's history. I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, as was my habit, and immediately sensed something was wrong. Grant was pacing near Lisa's desk, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his tie crooked in a way that signaled barely controlled panic. "Where are the presentation folders?" he was asking Lisa, who sat staring at her computer screen with the blank expression of someone watching their world collapse in real time. "I thought they were in the conference room," she replied weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What conference room? I asked you to prepare everything last week. The welcome packets, the facility maps, the safety briefing materials. Where are they?" Lisa's face had gone ashen. I put it on my calendar, but then I was so sick last week and I thought maybe Jennifer from marketing was handling the materials." Grant's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Jennifer handles promotional materials, not client presentations. This was your responsibility." From my desk 20 feet away, I could see the complete breakdown of their carefully maintained professional relationship. Grant was no longer the protective mentor and Lisa was no longer the competent protégé. They were just two people facing a career-ending disaster with no solutions in sight. "They'll be here in 45 minutes, Grant said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "What exactly am I supposed to tell them?" I glanced at the clock. 9:15 a.m. In my desk drawer, I had a complete backup file system I'd maintained for years. Copies of all major client documents, updated facility maps, emergency contact lists, and presentation templates that could be customized within minutes. It was the kind of redundant organization that came from 12 years of watching important things fall through bureaucratic cracks. Rising from my desk, I approached their crisis with the calm demeanor of someone who had been preparing for this moment without realizing it. "Grant," I said quietly, "I might be able to help." Both of them turned toward me with expressions of desperate hope. "I have backup copies of the standard presentation materials in my files," I continued. "If you give me 20 minutes and access to the conference room, I can have everything ready." "You have backup copies?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with confusion and something that might have been betrayal. "I keep copies of important client documents," I explained simply, "in case of emergencies." What I didn't say was that I'd been maintaining this shadow filing system precisely because I'd observed how frequently things went missing, how often critical information disappeared into the chaos of other people's organizational failures. Grant looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "Can you really pull this together?" "Give me 15 minutes, I said, already heading toward the supply room. I'll need someone to run copies while I set up the conference room. The next 20 minutes transformed me into someone I didn't know I could be. I moved through the office with purposeful efficiency, delegating tasks to colleagues who seemed surprised but willing to help. Jennifer brought promotional folders from marketing. Tom from shipping provided updated safety protocols. Sarah from accounting pulled the latest financial summaries. As I arranged materials in the conference room, I felt something awakening inside me. A competence and confidence that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten it existed. This wasn't just about saving Grant's presentation. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of more than quiet endurance. "These look professional," Jennifer commented, helping me arrange the welcome packets. "Did you design these layouts?" "Just modified the existing templates," I replied, though I'd actually improved them significantly, adding visual elements and reorganizing information for better flow. At 9:58 a.m. I stood in the conference room doorway watching Grant review the materials one final time. Everything was perfect. Better than perfect, actually. The presentation was more polished and comprehensive than anything Lisa had ever produced. "Erin," Grant said, looking up from the folders with an expression I couldn't quite read. This is excellent work." "I'm glad I could help," I replied, then stepped aside as our visitors arrived. The Hartwell Industries team consisted of 3 executives: CEO Margaret Hartwell herself, along with her operations director and chief financial officer. I positioned myself at the back of the room, officially just there to assist with logistics but actually observing every interaction. Grant presented beautifully, his natural charisma enhanced by having solid materials to work with. The facility tour went smoothly, with every question answered and every concern addressed. I found myself anticipating needs before they arose, offering additional documentation, providing clarification on technical details, ensuring the coffee stayed fresh and the presentation materials remained organized. "This is impressive," Margaret Hartwell said as we concluded the tour in the conference room. "Your facility management and safety protocols have clearly improved since our last visit." "We've been working hard to streamline our processes," Grant replied, though his eyes found mine across the room. Margaret's attention followed his gaze. "And who coordinated today's presentation?" The materials were exceptionally well organized. There was a moment of silence that stretched longer than it should have. Grant glanced toward Lisa's empty desk. She disappeared sometime during the tour, claiming another bout of stomach distress. "That would be Erin," Grant said finally. "She handles our client documentation systems." Margaret walked over to where I stood near the presentation displays. "These are your materials?" "I compiled them from various departments," I said modestly. "It's important that our clients have comprehensive information." "You've done excellent work," she said, then turned to address Grant. "She's clearly very capable. Why isn't she in a more prominent client-facing role?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Grant's mouth opened but no words emerged. Behind Margaret, her colleagues were nodding in agreement, clearly impressed by the organization and attention to detail they'd experienced. "Erin prefers to work behind the scenes," Grant finally managed. Margaret looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Is that true?" I felt the weight of the moment, the opportunity to either maintain my invisible status or step into something larger. "I enjoy making sure things run smoothly," I said carefully. "Whether that's behind the scenes or more directly with clients." "Well," Margaret said with a smile, "if you ever decide you want to expand your role, you should consider client relations. You have exactly the kind of competence and attention to detail we value in our vendor partnerships." After the clients left, the office buzzed with energy from the successful meeting. Colleagues who had barely noticed me for years stopped by my desk to offer congratulations and ask questions about the presentation materials. "That was incredible," Sarah from accounting said. "I had no idea you were keeping track of all that information." "Someone has to," I replied with a smile that felt more genuine than any expression I'd worn in months. Grant approached my desk as the office began to empty for lunch, his expression complex and unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. "You're welcome," I replied, not looking up from my computer. "I mean it, Erin. You saved my career today." Now I did look up, meeting his eyes directly. "I saved the account. Your career is your own responsibility." The drive home was silent, Grant's hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I stared out the passenger window, watching familiar scenery pass by while processing the morning's revelations about my own capabilities. We were no longer the same people who had driven to work that morning. The balance of our relationship, professional and personal, had shifted in ways neither of us was quite ready to acknowledge. But sitting in our quiet car, I knew that Margaret Hartwell's question would echo in both our minds. Why wasn't I in a more prominent role? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? The silence in our house Wednesday evening was different from the comfortable quiet of a couple settled into routine. This was the brittle silence of things breaking apart, of foundations crumbling beneath carefully maintained facades. Grant sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone with an expression I'd never seen before, equal parts anger, confusion, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Lisa hadn't shown up for work, hadn't called, hadn't responded to his increasingly frantic texts. Maybe she's really sick, I offered, setting a cup of coffee beside his elbow. That stomach bug has been persistent. He looked up at me with hollow eyes. She's not sick, Aaron. She's falling apart. The admission hung between us, raw and honest in a way that felt almost foreign coming from him. For weeks he'd defended Lisa's every failure, made excuses for her mounting incompetence, blamed external factors for her professional disasters. Now, confronted with her complete absence, he seemed to be processing the reality he'd been avoiding. Thursday brought a call from HR that changed everything. I was updating inventory records when my desk phone rang. Mrs. Patterson? This is Diana Morrison from Human Resources. Could you come to my office when you have a moment? I'd like to discuss some workplace concerns that have been brought to our attention. The walk to HR felt surreal. In 12 years at Meridian Foods, I'd never been called to Human Resources for anything more serious than updating my emergency contact information. Diana Morrison was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had a reputation for handling delicate situations with surgical precision. Please sit down, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her immaculate desk. I want to discuss some allegations that have been made regarding workplace dynamics in your department. My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my expression calm. What kind of allegations? Lisa Reynolds has filed a formal complaint claiming workplace harassment and sabotage. She believes coworkers have been deliberately undermining her work, hiding files, and creating a hostile environment that's affecting her health and performance. I nodded slowly, processing this information. That sounds concerning. She's also mentioned that she's been staying at your home, which creates some additional complexities regarding the workplace relationships involved. Diana's eyes were kind but penetrating. I need to understand the full scope of the situation. For the next hour, I answered questions with the same careful honesty I'd brought to every aspect of this situation. Yes, Lisa had been staying in our guest room. No, I hadn't observed any deliberate sabotage of her work. Yes, I had occasionally covered her responsibilities during her absences. No, I had never done anything to intentionally harm her professional standing. Several employees have mentioned that you stepped in to handle the Hartwell Industries presentation when Lisa was unable to perform her duties, Diana noted, consulting her file. Can you tell me about that? Grant was concerned about the client meeting, I said simply. I had backup documentation that could help, so I offered to assist. And you had this documentation because? I maintain backup files for important client relationships. I've seen too many things get lost or overlooked over the years. Diana made a note, then looked at me directly. Multiple colleagues have described you as exceptionally reliable and competent. Some have suggested that you might be better suited for more advanced responsibilities than your current position. The comment caught me off guard. I'm satisfied with my current role. Are you? She asked gently. Because from what I'm hearing, you've been functioning well above your official job description for quite some time. That afternoon the whispers started. Not malicious gossip, but the kind of focused conversation that happens when long-simmering workplace tensions finally reach a breaking point. I overheard fragments as I moved through the office. Always knew something was off about that situation. Grant's been making excuses for her for months. His wife is the one who actually knows how things work around here. By Friday, the investigation had expanded beyond Lisa's complaints. Other employees had apparently been documenting issues for months. Missed deadlines Lisa had blamed on system errors, important communications that had gone unanswered, the growing workload other staff members had absorbed to compensate for her failures. "This is bigger than we initially realized," Diana told me during a follow-up conversation. "We're looking at patterns of favoritism, boundary violations, and performance issues that go well beyond a single employee's complaints." Grant received his formal warning Monday morning. I wasn't privy to the details, but his face when he returned from the meeting told the story clearly enough. The confident manager who had casually dismissed my worth just weeks ago now looked like a man who understood that his professional reputation hung by an increasingly thin thread. Lisa's absence stretched into a second week. Her formal diagnosis of emotional burnout and workplace stress came with a doctor's note recommending extended leave. But everyone understood that this was less about recovery and more about face-saving, a graceful exit from a situation that had become untenable. The transfer came through on Tuesday. Lisa would be moving to a position in the accounting department, handling data entry and filing. Officially, it was described as a lateral move to better accommodate her health needs. Unofficially, everyone recognized it as a demotion that removed her from any client-facing responsibilities. Suddenly, people were approaching my desk with questions they'd never asked before. "Erin, do you know where the Henderson contract templates are? Could you show me how you organize these client files? Would you be interested in joining the Process Improvement Committee?" The recognition felt strange after years of invisible competence. Margaret Hartwell's question, "Why wasn't I in a more prominent role?" seemed to have planted seeds in minds throughout the office. I found myself training new hires, consulting on workflow efficiency, and being included in meetings where my input was not just welcomed but actively sought. At home, the packing process became a drawn-out ordeal that stretched across multiple weekends. Lisa would disappear for hours, then return to move a single box or rearrange items she'd already sorted. The guest room took on the chaotic appearance of someone who couldn't decide between leaving and staying, between admitting defeat and maintaining the pretense that this was all temporary. Grant moved through these days like a man processing the collapse of some cherished illusion. He'd built an entire fantasy around Lisa, the brilliant secretary who would transform his department, the sophisticated woman who appreciated his managerial vision, the professional partner who validated his importance. Watching that fantasy crumble left him quiet and withdrawn. "I didn't expect all this to happen," he said one evening, finding me in the laundry room where I was folding clothes with the same methodical precision I'd maintained throughout this entire ordeal. I looked at him, really looked, taking in the stress lines that had deepened around his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged with the weight of consequences he'd never anticipated. "Neither did I replied, continuing to fold. "Especially not the part where my breakfast tray made more of a difference than anything you ever said." The words emerged with quiet satisfaction mixed with genuine sadness. I'd been proven right, but the victory felt hollow when measured against what our marriage had become. We were two people who had shared 12 years and a mortgage, now staring at each other across a chasm that neither of us knew how to bridge. Grant opened his mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the laundry and the strange new reality we were all still learning to navigate. Outside, I could hear Lisa loading another box into her car, the sound marking another small step toward the end of the most bizarre chapter our quiet suburban life had ever contained. But somehow I suspected the most significant changes were still ahead of us. Saturday evening brought an unexpected quiet to our house. For the first time in weeks, no sounds echoed from the guest room. No pacing, no phone conversations, no muffled crying through thin walls. Lisa had finally finished her prolonged departure, loading the last box into her sedan while Grant stood helplessly in the driveway, watching 12 years of his marriage and 3 weeks of his fantasy disappear simultaneously. I had observed this final exodus from the kitchen window while preparing what I knew would be my last dinner in this house. The transfer paperwork sat completed on my laptop, submitted Friday afternoon during my lunch break while Grant attended another damage control meeting with upper management. The regional office position had materialized like an answer to prayers I hadn't known I was praying. Diana Morrison from HR had mentioned it almost casually during our final interview. "There's an opening for a client relations coordinator in our Denver branch. The pay increase would be substantial, and they specifically requested someone with your organizational background and problem-solving skills." I'd applied immediately, called in recommendations from colleagues who had witnessed my competence during the Lisa crisis, and received confirmation within 48 hours. Sometimes when you finally demonstrate your worth, opportunities appear that had been invisible before. That night, Grant and I moved around each other like strangers sharing temporary space. He attempted normal conversation over dinner, questions about my day, comments about the weather, but the words felt hollow, like actors performing a play whose plot they'd forgotten. "It's quiet without her here," he said finally, pushing food around his plate without eating. "Yes," I agreed. "It is." He looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to fill the silence with reassurance or analysis or some indication of how we should proceed. But I had no words left for managing his emotions or smoothing over uncomfortable realities. Sunday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of early autumn. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety or insomnia but from a sense of purpose that felt both foreign and completely natural. Today would be different from every morning that had preceded it. I prepared breakfast with the same methodical care I'd brought to Lisa's trays, but this time the presentation told a different story. Plain white toast, dry and unbuttered. Black coffee in a plain ceramic mug. No fruit, no garnish, no delicate china that connected this meal to generations of women who had served their families with love and care. The tray itself was the same one that had carried dozens of elaborate breakfasts to the guest room. The sterling silver serving piece my grandmother had received as a wedding gift, polished and maintained through decades of family gatherings and special occasions. But today it carried something unprecedented, an envelope that would reshape the trajectory of 2 lives. I climbed the stairs slowly, savoring the weight of the moment. Grant was awake, sitting up in bed and scrolling through his phone with the distracted energy of someone avoiding difficult thoughts. "Breakfast," I announced quietly, setting the tray across his lap with the same gentle precision I'd used for Lisa. His eyes widened as he took in the austere presentation. "This is different. I thought you might prefer something simpler," I replied, settling into the chair beside our bed. The same chair where I'd sat during countless conversations about Lisa's needs, Lisa's potential, Lisa's importance to his professional success. Grant lifted the envelope with fingers that weren't quite steady. "What's this about?" "Read it," I said simply. I watched his face as he processed the transfer letter, the acceptance of a position 3 states away, the formal notification that I would be starting my new role in 2 weeks. His expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a panic that seemed to surprise him with its intensity. "Aaron, you can't be serious about this." His voice carried the same tone he'd used when trying to convince upper management that Lisa's failures weren't indicative of deeper problems. "We can work this out. Lisa's gone now. Things can go back to normal." The word, normal, hung between us like an accusation. Normal. As if the past month had been an aberration rather than a revelation of truths that had been festering for years. "You told me she outranked me," I said gently, my voice carrying none of the anger that had once burned so hotly. "But she's gone now. And so am I." Grant set the letter aside and reached for my hand, but I'd already moved beyond the reach of gestures that might once have swayed me. "This is about more than Lisa. You know that, right? This is about us, about our marriage, about the life we've built together." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man I'd fallen in love with 16 years ago, but someone who had become a stranger through a series of small betrayals and casual dismissals that had accumulated like interest on a debt he'd never acknowledged. "Yes," I agreed. "It is about us. It's about the fact that you invited another woman into our home without consulting me. It's about the way you elevated her opinion above mine, defended her incompetence while dismissing my capabilities. It's about 12 years of being taken for granted while someone else received credit for work I'd been doing all along. But that's over now," he said desperately. "I see that I made mistakes. I can do better." The conversation that followed felt surreal. Grant arguing for a marriage he'd been systematically undermining, pleading for a second chance with someone he'd consistently undervalued. I listened with the detached compassion of someone watching a stranger's crisis, offering the same patient attention I'd given to his problems throughout our marriage, but without the emotional investment that had once made his concerns my own. "I've already signed the lease on an apartment in Denver," I said when he finally ran out of arguments. "The moving truck comes Thursday." Over the following week, I packed 12 years of shared life with the same methodical efficiency I brought to everything else. Grant oscillated between angry accusations and desperate bargaining, sometimes within the same conversation. He couldn't understand how I'd planned this so quietly, so thoroughly without his knowledge. But that was the point he'd never grasped. I'd been handling important details without his knowledge for years. The only difference now was that I was handling my own life instead of his. The transfer to Denver exceeded every expectation. My new office overlooked the mountains, and my colleagues treated me with the respect that comes from being specifically recruited for your competence rather than being inherited as someone else's spouse. Client relations work suited me perfectly, combining organizational skills with problem-solving and interpersonal dynamics that actually mattered. Grant called frequently during the first month, his tone shifting from anger to negotiation to genuine bewilderment. "I don't understand how we got here," he said during one late-night conversation. "Everything was fine before Lisa came along." "No," I corrected gently. "Everything was convenient for you before Lisa came along. There's a difference." The divorce proceedings were remarkably civil. 12 years of marriage dissolved through paperwork and equitable distribution, mediated by lawyers who seemed almost disappointed by the lack of drama. Grant kept the house and most of the furniture. I kept my grandmother's china and the silver serving tray that had started everything. Now 6 months later, I make breakfast for myself on quiet Sunday mornings in my bright apartment kitchen. Sometimes I use the silver tray, placing my own perfectly prepared meal on the surface that once carried so much manipulation disguised as service. Each time I see my reflection in that polished surface, I smile. Because I finally learned the most important lesson of my adult life. The difference between serving someone and serving yourself is often just a matter of choosing the right tray. And sometimes the smallest acts of apparent subservience can become the foundation for the greatest acts of liberation. The secretary moved out after 3 weeks of disrupting our marriage. I moved on after 12 years of maintaining it. And in the end, we both got exactly what we deserved. If this story of quiet revenge had you completely hooked, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Aaron served that final breakfast tray with the transfer letter, turning 12 years of service into pure empowerment. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more incredible revenge stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. At our divorce, my husband showed up with his new girlfriend, grinning like he'd won. The judge turned to me and said, "Ma'am, as owner of this courthouse, how would you like to proceed?" His smile dropped. I handed him a broom. "Your new job starts today. Sweep the floors you walked out on." The judge's gavel slammed down like a thunderclap, jolting me back to reality. My fingers clutched the manila envelope containing divorce papers, knuckles white against the pale yellow. Across the polished oak table sat Daniel, his arm draped possessively around Stephanie's shoulders, both wearing matching smirks that said they'd already won. "Mrs. Rachel Wilson, is there anything you'd like to add before we proceed?" Judge Franklin's voice cut through the tension. I opened my mouth to respond when his clerk rushed in, whispered something in his ear. The judge's eyebrows shot up and he cleared his throat. "I've just been informed of an unusual situation." He shuffled through some papers handed to him. "It appears Mrs. Wilson is now the legal owner of this courthouse, following the passing of her grandmother, Judge Catherine Mason." Daniel's smug smile faltered for the first time. "As owner of this property," Judge Franklin continued, sounding as surprised as everyone looked, "you have certain privileges according to the deed. How would you like to proceed?" A week earlier I wouldn't have known how to answer. But that was before everything changed. The lawyer's office had been stuffy that Monday morning. "Your grandmother was quite specific," Brian explained, sliding the will across his desk. "The courthouse was privatized 2 years ago as part of the county's cost-cutting measures. Catherine purchased it anonymously through a holding company." I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. "She bought the courthouse? Why?" "Catherine always said justice needed a home," Brian smiled sadly. "She didn't trust the county commissioners to maintain it properly." He tapped on another paragraph. "And now it's yours." The inheritance news should have been the most shocking part of my week. It wasn't. That same evening, I was searching for my phone charger in Daniel's nightstand when I found them. Dozens of text messages between him and Stephanie. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through their exchanges, each message more intimate than the last. The most recent, "Can't wait until she's out of the picture. 2 more weeks, baby." I sat on our bed, the bed we'd shared for 7 years, holding his phone as my world collapsed. Photos. plans for their future, complaints about me. The timestamps revealed their affair had started while I was spending nights at the hospital with Catherine during her final months. When Daniel came home, I was waiting, his unlocked phone on the coffee table between us. How long? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He didn't even try to deny it. Rachel, you have to understand. How long? His shoulders sagged, not in shame but relief. 14 months. It just happened. With my best friend. The one who was my maid of honor. You were always at the hospital with Catherine. Stephanie was there for me. I laughed, a hollow sound I didn't recognize. While I was caring for my dying grandmother, you decided the appropriate response was to sleep with my best friend? I wasn't happy, he said, as if that explained everything. We haven't been happy for a long time. By morning he was gone along with his essential belongings. No real goodbye, just a text, staying at Stephanie's. My lawyer will be in touch. 3 days later I stood in Catherine's study, sorting through decades of her life. The house still smelled like her leather-bound law books and the faint trace of lavender perfume. I ran my fingers along her desk, remembering how she'd sit there in the evenings, glasses perched on her nose, reviewing cases long after retirement. That's when I found it, wedged between 2 legal volumes on property law. A yellow document dated 1923. Signed by my great-grandfather, Judge William Mason. The Mason Clause, as it was labeled, detailed specific conditions of the courthouse donation to the county, including an unusual provision that the owner could assign remedial community service to any individual who brought disgrace upon the court or its proceedings. I almost missed its significance until a note in Catherine's handwriting caught my eye. Still legally binding, confirmed 2022 during privatization. My grandmother had known exactly what she was doing. The funeral was held that Friday. Catherine would have approved of the simplicity. No overwrought eulogies, just sincere words from those who respected her. I stood receiving condolences, my black dress hanging loosely on my frame after a week of barely eating. She was a remarkable woman, Judge Franklin said, clasping my hand. Our county's first female judge. We'll never see her like again. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, when a familiar laugh cut through the solemn atmosphere. Turning toward the sound, I spotted them near the entrance. Daniel in a charcoal suit I'd bought him last Christmas. Stephanie beside him in a dress that was definitely not appropriate for a funeral. They weren't even pretending to mourn, caught up in their own private joke. They hadn't seen me yet. I watched as Stephanie adjusted Daniel's tie, her fingers lingering on his chest. He beamed at her with an affection he hadn't shown me in years. The sight should have crushed me, but instead something hardened inside. It wasn't just anger. It was resolve. Catherine had taught me that justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration and consequences that fit the offense. As I looked at them, then down at my grandmother's rings on my finger, a plan began forming. In that moment, standing among mourners while my husband flirted with my former best friend at my grandmother's funeral, I understood why Catherine had purchased the courthouse. She created a safety net I never knew I would need. The last gift from a woman who had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I turned to Brian, who'd been watching the same scene with thinly veiled disgust. I need you to keep the courthouse ownership quiet until the divorce hearing, I said. And I need to understand exactly how that community service clause works. He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. Catherine would be proud. As Daniel finally noticed me watching and had the decency to look uncomfortable, I fingered the old document in my purse. My grandmother had given me more than a building. She'd given me the perfect opportunity for justice. And in 2 weeks, when Daniel walked into court expecting to take half of everything I had left, he would discover just how much Catherine had taught her granddaughter about the scales of justice. 2 days after Catherine's funeral, I sat cross-legged on my living room floor surrounded by a fortress of cardboard boxes. Daniel had texted that he needed more of his things. Rather than let him waltz in whenever he pleased, I decided to pack everything myself. His phone had been the first piece of evidence, but as I sorted through his belongings, I found more breadcrumbs of betrayal. A receipt for a weekend getaway at a lakeside cabin dated last December, while I was spending Christmas Eve at Catherine's hospital bedside. A silver bracelet with Stephanie's initials engraved inside, too expensive for a casual gift between friends. Hotel keycards tucked into winter coat pockets. My hands trembled as I unearthed a hidden folder in his desk drawer. Inside were printouts of real estate listings in Colorado. Estates Stephanie had always talked about moving to. Properties Daniel and I had never discussed. Houses meant for their future, not ours. I reached for my phone and scrolled back through Daniel's messages I'd photographed before he took his phone back. The earliest exchanges with Stephanie started 14 months ago, when Catherine had her first stroke. "Rachel's at the hospital again," he'd written. "Come over." The reply came quickly, "On my way." She'll never know. But it wasn't just the messages that haunted me. It was the memories now cast in a different light. The warning signs I'd missed while juggling hospital visits and my own career. Last Thanksgiving, Stephanie had arrived at our dinner party wearing a perfume I'd never smelled before. That evening, Daniel disappeared for 20 minutes to take a work call. When he returned, that same scent clung faintly to his collar. During Catherine's second hospitalization, I'd called home past midnight to tell Daniel I was staying overnight. In the background, I heard a cabinet close, the clink of glasses. When questioned, he claimed he was just getting water. The next day, one of my wine glasses was in the dishwasher, lipstick on the rim that wasn't my shade. There were dozens of such moments. Daniel working late, weekend errands taking hours longer than they should, Stephanie canceling our lunch plans with last-minute excuses. 4 months, they'd been laughing behind my back while I sat at my grandmother's bedside, holding her hand as she slipped away. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Brian stood on my porch, his familiar face a welcome relief. "Brought reinforcements," he said, holding up a bottle of wine and take-out bags from our favorite diner. "Figured you weren't eating properly." Brian and I had known each other since 3rd grade when he defended me against playground bullies. Now he defended people in courtrooms, continuing a Mason family tradition despite not sharing our blood. "You're a lifesaver," I said, clearing space at the kitchen table. As we ate, I showed him what I'd found. Brian listened, his expression darkening with each new detail. "The worst part is how calculated it was," I said, pushing food around my plate. "They were waiting for Catherine to die. Planning their escape while I was planning funeral arrangements." Brian reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Rachel, this changes things legally. Infidelity with documented evidence, especially this extensive, impacts divorce settlements in our state. Does it matter? Daniel's lawyer will still try to take half of everything." I looked around at the house we'd bought together 4 years ago. "I might lose this place." "Actually," Brian said, pulling papers from his briefcase, "that's what I came to discuss. I've been reviewing Catherine's will and the courthouse documentation. It's remarkable." For the next hour he explained the complexities of my inheritance. The courthouse had been built on land donated by my great-grandfather William Mason in 1923, with specific conditions attached to the gift. When the county privatized the building 2 years ago, Catherine had purchased it through a shell corporation, ensuring the original deed restrictions remained intact. "The Mason Clause is legally fascinating," Brian said, pointing to highlighted sections. "It was written to ensure the courthouse would always serve justice, not just technically but morally. Anyone who brings disgrace upon the court can be assigned community service by the property owner." "Is that even enforceable today?" Brian nodded. Catherine had it verified by the state Supreme Court during the privatization. She updated the language but kept the spirit intact. "It's binding." "So I could assign community service to Daniel?" "Yes, if the presiding judge acknowledges the clause." A plan began forming in my mind, but before I could respond, my phone buzzed. An email from an unfamiliar law firm. I opened it to find divorce papers, along with a letter outlining Daniel's demands. Half of our savings, half the equity in our house, half of my retirement accounts. Even half of a small inheritance Catherine had left me years ago. "He wants everything," I said, passing my phone to Brian. "Even though he's the one who—" "Standard aggressive opening position," Brian said, scanning the document. "They don't know about the courthouse yet. That's our advantage." The doorbell rang. Daniel stood on the porch, Stephanie waiting in his car at the curb. "I'm here for my boxes," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They're in the garage." I crossed my arms. "I received your lawyer's email. Rachel, be reasonable. I just want what's fair." Fair. The word tasted bitter. Was it fair when you were sleeping with my best friend while I was caring for my dying grandmother? Daniel's face hardened. Catherine was all you cared about for the past year. I needed someone who put me first. And you think that entitles you to half of everything I have left? He shrugged. That's how divorce works. You'll get over it eventually. As he turned to leave, I called after him. Daniel, one more thing. The funeral suit you wore yesterday? The one I bought you? I donated it this morning. It was petty, but the flash of annoyance on his face felt like the first victory in a war I hadn't asked for but was determined to win. After he drove away, Brian stood beside me on the porch. You know he has no idea what's coming, right? I watched the taillights of Daniel's car disappear around the corner, Stephanie's blonde head visible in the passenger seat. Catherine always said justice works best when it's unexpected. I turned to Brian. Let's make sure our first court date is in courtroom 3. Her old courtroom? Why? Because that's where the Mason family portrait hangs, I said. I want to see Daniel's face when he realizes exactly whose legacy he's up against. 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal preparations. Brian arranged for our divorce hearing to be scheduled in courtroom 3 as I'd requested. We met almost daily, crafting our strategy with the meticulous care of master chess players. Everything has to appear normal until the right moment, Brian explained as we sat in his office, surrounded by case files and takeout containers. Daniel's lawyer has already filed motions to expedite property division. He's in a hurry to start his new life, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Which works in our favor. We'll let him think he's winning until we reveal our hand. We decided I would visit the courthouse the following day, officially to familiarize myself with the proceedings, but really to begin understanding my inheritance more intimately. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood like a limestone sentinel in the town square, its classical columns and broad steps projecting authority and permanence. Catherine had often told me how she'd walk up those steps each morning, feeling the weight of responsibility with every stride. Now, as I climbed them myself, I felt strangely like I was walking in her footsteps. Inside, the high ceilings and polished marble floors echoed with whispered conversations and the click of heels. I found my way to the maintenance office, where Brian had arranged for me to meet Walter Jenkins, the building supervisor who'd worked there for over 30 years. Miss Rachel, Walter greeted me, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. Judge Mason's granddaughter. Been expecting you. Walter gave me a behind-the-scenes tour, showing me everything from the ancient boiler room to the judge's private chambers. As we walked, he shared stories about Catherine. Your grandmother, she knew every person who worked here by name, Walter said as we passed a young janitor mopping the corridor. Maria, how's your son doing at college? He called out. The woman looked up, surprised. He's doing great, Mr. Jenkins. First in his engineering class. Walter turned back to me. Judge Mason set up a scholarship fund for Maria's boy. Did it quietly, didn't want recognition. That's the kind of person she was. Throughout the day, I met court clerks, bailiffs, and administrative staff who had similar stories. Catherine had remembered birthdays, attended funerals, celebrated marriages. She'd been strict on the bench but compassionate beyond it. When my wife got sick, one elderly security guard told me, Judge Mason adjusted my schedule so I could take her to treatments. Never docked my pay. Said family comes first. By afternoon, I felt both humbled and strengthened. These people had respected my grandmother not just for her legal mind but for her humanity. I wasn't just inheriting a building, I was inheriting a legacy of fairness and integrity. I was heading toward the exit when my phone rang. Daniel's lawyer. Mrs. Wilson, the voice on the other end oozed false courtesy. I'm calling with a final settlement offer before we proceed to court. My client is being extremely generous. The generous offer would leave me with 30% of our assets and saddled with most of our debt. I muted the phone and took a deep breath, remembering Brian's coaching. I'll review it with my attorney, I said evenly. Thank you for the call. That evening, Brian brought additional documents he'd subpoenaed from Daniel's bank. What we discovered left me gasping. He opened a separate account last year, Brian said, spreading statements across my dining table. He's been diverting money from your joint accounts for months. The statements revealed withdrawals timed perfectly with Catherine's health declines, as if each hospital admission was an opportunity for Daniel to siphon more funds. There's more, Brian said grimly, pulling out real estate documents. He put a deposit on a house in Colorado 3 months ago. Used your joint savings, but only his name is on the paperwork. I stared at the property listing. A mountain home with views of the Rockies. Daniel had always dismissed my dreams of traveling as impractical, yet he'd been planning his escape to a luxury retreat. Can he do that? Not legally. It's financial infidelity on top of actual infidelity. Brian sorted the papers into neat piles. The judge will take a very dim view of this. As the hearing date approached, I felt increasingly nervous. What if our plan didn't work? What if Daniel's expensive lawyer outmaneuvered us? The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I decided to go to Catherine's house one last time. The old Victorian had been in our family for generations. I'd already decided to move in after the divorce. A fresh start in a place filled with better memories than the house Daniel and I had shared. I wandered through the dark halls until I reached Catherine's bedroom. Her closet still held her clothes, the faint scent of lavender lingering among the fabric. Behind her winter coats, I spotted a garment bag I hadn't noticed during previous visits. Inside was her judicial robe, the black fabric still crisp despite years of use. Pinned to it was an envelope addressed simply, "To the next generation of justice." With trembling fingers I opened it. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, I've passed on and you've discovered what I've left you. The courthouse isn't just a building. It's the physical embodiment of our family's commitment to justice. William built it, Edward defended it, I presided in it, and now you must preserve it. The Mason Clause exists because my father believed true justice should have teeth. In your hands, this power must be wielded not for vengeance but for balance. Remember, the goal isn't to destroy the wrongdoer but to restore what was broken, even if that means breaking pride to rebuild character. When you stand in that courtroom tomorrow, you'll face someone who wronged you. Choose your response wisely. Justice without mercy is tyranny, but mercy without justice is surrender. I've watched you grow into a woman of strength and compassion. I trust you'll know exactly what to do when the moment comes. With all my love, Catherine." I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. In that moment I felt Catherine's presence so strongly it was as if she stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. I carefully rehung the robe but took the letter with me. As I drove home in the pre-dawn light, I realized that Catherine hadn't just left me a building, she'd given me back my power. Tomorrow Daniel would discover exactly what that meant. Morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Catherine's letter rested in my blazer pocket, a tangible reminder of her strength. I dressed carefully, a navy suit she had given me for my first job interview, pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and a quiet determination that came from somewhere deep inside. "Ready?" Brian asked when he picked me up. I nodded. "Let's finish this." The courthouse steps were already busy with the day's legal proceedings. As we climbed them, I felt eyes on me, nods from staff members I'd met during my visit, a reassuring smile from Walter Jenkins standing near the entrance. "You're not alone here," Brian murmured, noticing the subtle gestures of support. Courtroom 3 was exactly as Catherine had described it in her stories. Imposing oak paneling, the state seal mounted prominently behind the judge's bench, and on the side wall the Mason family portrait. For generations of legal minds stared down at the proceedings, Catherine among them, her eyes seeming to follow me as I took my seat. The doors opened again and my stomach clenched. Daniel walked in, Stephanie trailing behind him like an afterthought. He'd gotten a haircut, bought a new suit. They slid into the seats across the aisle, not even trying to hide their connection. Stephanie placed her hand on his arm possessively, both of them radiating the confidence of people who believed they'd already won. Daniel's attorney, a shark-faced man named Gregory Palmer, strutted in moments later, flanked by 2 younger associates carrying stacks of binders. The excessive show of legal force was clearly meant to intimidate. "Quite the production," Brian whispered. 3 attorneys for a straightforward divorce? "He's trying to overwhelm us," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath my calm exterior. The bailiff called the court to order and Judge Franklin entered. He was a contemporary of Catherine's, having served alongside her for many years. His eyes flickered to the family portrait, then to me, and I caught a glimpse of something. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "Divorce proceedings for Wilson versus Wilson," he announced. Counselors, your appearances please. Palmer rose first, his voice booming with practiced authority. Gregory Palmer for the petitioner, Daniel Wilson, Your Honor. We're prepared to move forward expeditiously today. Brian stood next. Brian Mitchell for the respondent, Rachel Wilson, Your Honor. Judge Franklin nodded. Mr. Palmer, as petitioner's counsel, you may begin. Palmer launched into his opening, painting Daniel as a hard-working husband who had suffered emotional neglect during my grandmother's illness. The characterization was so far from reality that I had to dig my nails into my palms to keep from objecting. My client simply wants an equitable division of marital assets, Palmer concluded, including the family home, retirement accounts, and any inheritance received during the marriage. I glanced at Daniel, who was leaning back in his chair, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. Beside him, Stephanie mirrored his smugness. Judge Franklin turned to Brian. Counsel for the respondent? Brian rose slowly. Your Honor, before addressing property division, there's a unique jurisdictional matter the court should be aware of. He paused. The respondent, Mrs. Rachel Wilson, is now the legal owner of this courthouse building following the passing of her grandmother, Judge Catherine Mason. The revelation fell like a thunderclap in the silent room. Daniel's head snapped toward me, his smile vanishing. Stephanie's hand froze on his arm. Palmer recovered quickly. Your Honor, this is clearly a delaying tactic. Even if true, private ownership of a public building has no bearing on divorce proceedings. Actually, Brian continued, producing a document, I have here the certified deed transfer, along with the original Mason clause dating to 1923 and reaffirmed during the county's privatization process 2 years ago. Judge Franklin accepted the paperwork, studying it with increasing interest. I remember when the county sold this building, he said, looking up. Catherine never mentioned she was the buyer. She preferred discretion, Your Honor, I said, speaking for the first time. Daniel's face had gone from shock to calculating. He leaned toward Palmer, whispering urgently. Palmer nodded and stood again. Your Honor, regardless of building ownership, we maintain that Mrs. Wilson's inheritance is subject to equitable division as marital property. Judge Franklin peered at Palmer over his reading glasses. Mr. Palmer, are you familiar with the Mason clause? Palmer hesitated. I can't say that I am, Your Honor. Then allow me to enlighten you. Judge Franklin read aloud. The owner of this property reserves the right to assign remedial community service to any individual who brings disgrace upon the court or its proceedings, as determined by the presiding judge. He looked up. This clause was written by Judge William Mason and has been upheld by our state Supreme Court. Quite remarkable legal craftsmanship, actually. The confidence drained from Daniel's face. He whispered something to Palmer, who shook his head in disbelief. Judge Franklin turned to me. Mrs. Wilson, as the current property owner, do you wish to invoke this clause? The courtroom fell silent. I could feel Catherine's letter against my heart, her words echoing in my mind. Justice without mercy is tyranny, but mercy without justice is surrender. I stood, my voice steadier than I expected. Yes, Your Honor. Daniel Wilson has disgraced this court and my family by demanding half of all assets while concealing financial information and engaging in documented infidelity with my former friend. I pulled out the evidence Brian and I had gathered. These bank statements show he's been hiding money and making property purchases without my knowledge, all while I was caring for my dying grandmother. Judge Franklin reviewed the documents, his expression darkening. Mr. Wilson, these are serious allegations. Daniel stood, his face flushed. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. She's trying to use her grandmother's position to seek justice, I interrupted. I'm not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I'm asking for consequences that fit the offense. And what would you propose? Judge Franklin asked. I reached into my pocket, touching Catherine's letter for courage. I request that Daniel Wilson be assigned janitorial duties at this courthouse for 1 year, working under the supervision of building management. In exchange, I'll drop all claims against him for financial infidelity and hidden assets. Daniel's face contorted in outrage. You can't be serious. I'm an executive. I can't. Mr. Wilson, Judge Franklin cut in sharply, you're not in a position to object. The evidence of your financial deception is substantial. He turned to me. Mrs. Wilson, Your proposal is unusual but within your rights under the Mason Clause. I'll take a brief recess to consider it." As Judge Franklin left the bench, Daniel stormed across the aisle toward me, his face twisted with fury. "You think this is funny? You think you can humiliate me like this?" Brian stepped between us. "Back off, Daniel. Now." "This isn't over," Daniel hissed at me. I met his gaze steadily. "You're right. It's just beginning." Judge Franklin returned to the bench after 20 minutes, his decision written clearly on his face even before he spoke. "Having reviewed the evidence and the legal standing of the Mason Clause, I find the respondent's request both reasonable and justified." He looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Wilson, you have demonstrated financial deception and betrayal of trust. Under normal circumstances, this would result in punitive financial judgments. Mrs. Wilson has offered an alternative I find fitting." Daniel's mouth opened in protest, but Palmer placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Beginning Monday, you will report to Mr. Walter Jenkins for janitorial duties at this courthouse for a period of 1 year. Standard working hours, minimum wage. In exchange, Mrs. Wilson will waive claims to your hidden assets, and you will surrender any claim to the marital home." The gavel came down with finality. Court adjourned. As people began filing out, Stephanie remained frozen in her seat, her expression cycling between shock and calculation. When Daniel turned to her, she avoided his eyes. "We should go," I heard her say, already inching toward the exit. "We can fight this." But the look on her face told a different story. She hadn't signed up for a boyfriend with a janitor's salary and a year-long obligation that would keep him tied to this town, and to me. Walter approached as the courtroom emptied. "I'll take good care of him, Miss Rachel," he said with a wink. "We start at 6 a.m. sharp." On Monday morning I couldn't resist driving past the courthouse. Daniel's luxury sedan was parked in the service lot, looking absurdly out of place. Through the window of the maintenance entrance, I glimpsed him being issued a gray uniform by Walter. The sight should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt something unexpected. A quiet sense of closure. That evening, Brian came over with Chinese food and paperwork for the Catherine Mason Courthouse Preservation Foundation. "The judge approved the settlement formally," he said, passing me the documents. "Daniel's lawyer tried to appeal but withdrew it this afternoon." "Did he say why?" Brian grinned. "Apparently Stephanie had a change of heart about their relationship. Packed up and left for Colorado without him yesterday." I wasn't surprised. Stephanie had always followed the money, from her wealthy college boyfriend to her successful boss to my husband. Daniel, without his executive salary and with courthouse dust on his shoes, held no appeal for her. "How do you feel about that?" Brian asked carefully. I considered the question. Relieved, actually. Their relationship was built on lies. At least now the truth is out in the open. Over the next few weeks, I divided my time between settling into Catherine's house and setting up the foundation. The courthouse needed repairs Catherine had planned but hadn't completed. The roof leaked in the east wing, the heating system was ancient, and the accessibility ramps needed updating. My background in historical preservation made me uniquely qualified to oversee the renovations. Each morning I'd arrive to find contractors and review plans, occasionally catching glimpses of Daniel mopping floors or emptying trash bins. He'd avert his eyes whenever we passed, his face flushed with humiliation. It took a month before he spoke to me. I was examining water damage in a corridor when he approached with his cleaning cart. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked bitterly. "To watch me scrub toilets every day?" I considered his question seriously. "No, Daniel. What I wanted was a husband who wouldn't betray me while my grandmother was dying. What I wanted was honesty." I gestured to his uniform. "This isn't about humiliation. It's about consequences for choices." His shoulders slumped slightly. "Stephanie's gone. Took what was left in our account and moved to Colorado with some guy she met online." "I'm sorry," I said and meant it. No matter what he'd done, being used and discarded hurt. I knew that pain all too well. He laughed mirthlessly. "No, you're not. I'm not sorry you're facing consequences, but I am sorry you're hurting." The distinction seemed to register. He nodded once and continued down the hall, the squeaky wheel of his cart marking his retreat. As winter melted into spring, something unexpected happened. I found my place within the courthouse community Catherine had nurtured. I joined the County Historical Society, hosted fundraisers for building improvements, and established a scholarship similar to the one Catherine had created for Maria's son. People who had known my grandmother began sharing more stories, not just about her fairness on the bench but about her mischievous sense of humor, her terrible cooking, her passionate advocacy for historic preservation. Through their memories I found pieces of her I'd never known, and by extension pieces of myself. And Daniel? Something changed in him too. The resentment gradually faded from his eyes. He began taking pride in his work. The floors shone a little brighter, the brass fixtures gleamed. Walter reported that he never complained, never arrived late. 6 months into his service, I was working late in what had once been Catherine's chambers, now my office for the foundation. A knock at the door revealed Daniel with his cleaning supplies. "Sorry," he said, genuinely apologetic. "I didn't realize anyone was still here." "It's fine. Come in." He moved efficiently around the office, emptying the waste bin, dusting shelves. His movements had the confidence of routine now, not the awkwardness of someone performing unfamiliar tasks. "The foundation's doing good work," he said, nodding toward the architectural plans on my desk. "The ramp installation for the west entrance will help a lot of people." Surprised by his observation, I nodded. "That was Catherine's plan originally. I'm just carrying it forward." "She would have been proud of you." The words seemed to surprise him as much as me. "I mean it, Rachel. You've done something meaningful here." He paused, looking around the office. "I never really got her, you know? Judge Catherine. I thought she was just a stern old lady taking you away from me. I didn't see the legacy she was building." "Yeah." He finished cleaning in silence, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just for the affair or the money. I'm sorry I didn't understand what mattered to you." After he left, I sat in Catherine's chair, my chair now, and gazed at her portrait on the wall. 6 months ago I'd wanted revenge, wanted to see Daniel suffer. But watching him find humility through honest work hadn't brought the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, it had given me perspective. The Mason clause wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. Daniel was rebuilding his character through daily labor. I was rebuilding my life through purpose. Even the courthouse itself was being restored, beam by beam, brick by brick. Catherine had known all along what I was just beginning to understand. True justice wasn't about making others feel small. It was about creating the space for people to become better, including yourself.